Hey guys, Dr. Marcus Hotel here, back for lecture number 3 in the Training Principles course, the Overload Principle. The subtitle here is kind of cool. It's Why the Best Training Will Always Be Hard Training. Kind of good news, bad news. Let's see what overload entails. Today's lecture, we're going to go through a very simple definition. Then we're going to go through a technical definition to be very precise. It's actually a 2-part definition for overload, which is very interesting, has a couple of really interesting implications. We're going to go through some examples of how to properly execute the overload principle, how to mess it up, and we're going to go through some implications, just kind of basic takeaway points on, okay, granted that the overload principle is important, how do we change our training? How do we make sure we're attending to it in our training? Now, a really big point there is overload is principle number 2. It is the most important principle of all, second only to specificity. So in other ways, so put it another way, as long as your training is specific, the most important thing about it is going to be how overloading it is, or rather, is it overloading? With me so far? So specificity is number 1, overload is number 2, which means as long as training is pointed in the right direction and checks all the parts about being specific, checks off with the specificity principle, it being overloading is the next most important part by a long shot. What does overloading mean? Well, simple definition is to improve the most, that your training has to be both hard and getting harder over time. That is the easiest way to define the overload principle. So going back to the arrangement of specificity and overload, the most important thing about your training is that it needs to be specific to what it is you're training for. Once we've checked off that it is specific, it has to be tough and getting tougher on a regular basis. So to put this in a real simple example, if you want to be the best marathoner you can be, your training has to have a lot of running of long distances and all of the other subsystem training that you'll do. And those distances have to be challenging, the paces have to be challenging, and they have to get more challenging over time. If you are a weightlifter, then your training should have a lot of movements that look like the weightlifting movements and the movements themselves, and of course the subsystems, specificity, but the weights you lift should get heavier and heavier over time because that is going to be overloading, and they should start out in any particular session on average be pretty heavy already and get heavier from there. That's where we get into the technical definition of overload. So overload is a 2-part definition. Training is considered overloading if it meets both of the following conditions completely. Okay, so then training is considered what I would term completely overloading. Training can be partially overloading and still accomplish some measure of good things for us. It can give us adaptations, but the best kind of training is training that is completely overloading. It means it checks off both of these conditions, not just one or the other. And obviously, if it checks up 0 of them, well, it's not going to make you much better at all. Condition number 1, to put simply, is that training has to be hard. Put technically, it has to be within the maximal threshold of the trained system. Some examples. For volume, how much training should you be doing? Well, it should be above what we term minimum effective volume. It sounds like a super fancy term. It's actually really simple. The smallest amount of training that actually gives you some sort of results, right? You're not going to pretend that after years of lifting, 1 set of lifting a week for your chest is going to get your chest bigger. As a matter of fact, it's just going to keep making your chest smaller and smaller, as it's not enough to even prevent losses. You know that only maybe above 10 sets per week do you actually see growth, and you see growth all the way up to 20 sets per week, and then it's too much to recover from. You don't see any growth past 20, just again more decline from overreaching and overtraining. But maybe above 10 sets per week or something like that, you're going to see some kind of significant results. So training can be overloading on volumes only if it's above your minimum effective volume. If it takes 10 sets a week to grow your chest, but you're training chest 6 sets a week, you're just not going to grow your chest. You're too far away from that threshold of overload, which is 10 sets and above, to actually make any meaningful gains. For relative intensity, we have another way to define this overload threshold. So relative intensity more or less means how hard you're trying at any one time. basically any set in resistance training that's done further from 5 repetitions in reserve or more is probably not likely to be in the overload threshold and thus promote any sorts of meaningful gains for anyone but beginners. What does that mean? That means if you finish your average set and you could have done 5, 6, 7, 8 or more reps before failing, that's probably not challenging enough relative to your abilities to make you progress very much, thus it is not overloading. If you're going 2 reps shy of failure, 1 rep shy of failure, 3, even 4 reps shy of failure, that's challenging enough. Now notice, 4 reps shy of failure does meet our criteria. It will get you some growth. 3 reps shy of failure might get you a little bit more growth, 2 reps a little more, and 1 rep even more still at any one unit of time. But anything past about 5 reps away from failure probably isn't challenging enough, even if it's heavy relatively speaking, to get you what you want. For example, if you take your 10 repetition max and you do sets of 3 with it, how overloading is that to the system? Well, gee, doing sets of 8 or sets of 7 is going to be pretty tough, but sets of 3, that's kind of just like a progressive warm-up. Not even progressive. It's just a warm-up that keeps going. Every set of 3 you do warms you up, and then you get cooled down between sets, and it warms you back up. You're not really disrupting the system to any meaningful extent, especially if you're well-trained. You're not likely to get a whole lot of benefit from that, certainly not as much. So that's overload as stated in relative intensity terms. What about absolute intensity? Well, for hypertrophy, it's probably about 60% 1RM. Can you get gains on hypertrophy from below 60% 1RM training? Yes. Although you have to go about things in a bit of a different way, really pump up the volume or really do something else challenging, get really close to failure, knock one of the other ones off. But if you're doing 60% 1RM or above for hypertrophy, now you're probably in that overload threshold where it's enough weight to cause hypertrophy. If you want to get stronger, you should probably use weights that are at least 75% of your 1 rep max or heavier on average. Those tend to be heavy enough to be in the overload threshold within that threshold. Now that threshold goes all the way up to 100% of your 1 rep max, but anything below, much below 75% of your 1 rep, it could make you bigger if you did enough volume with it, but it's probably not going to do a whole lot for making you stronger, especially if you're a more intermediate or advanced athlete. Lastly, for peak power and velocity, so for power and speed, it's been shown that if you drop off below about 90% peak power and probably even a little bit higher for speed training, so if you're running sprints and you're below 90% of your fastest sprint, if you're anything but a beginner or novice, you're probably not going to get a whole lot out of that training. It's just kind of work being done, and it's kind of being done, right? You grab your pencil and you write with it, but for some reason that hasn't given you a world-class grip yet. Is it because you don't write enough with your pencil? You write all the time with your pencil, but the resistance that is being provided by the paper and the graphite touching together is just not enough force to make you much stronger. It's good at making you endurant in writing, but not much stronger. So just the same way, if you are doing snatches and clean and jerks and you're starting to slow down so much, you have to put a lot less weight on the bar, your velocity is starting to drop off a lot, then you're no longer training for power. You might be training for strength because you're still doing reps, or for size, but it's not power. So overload is specific to the actual thing we want it to overload, what we want to improve. So everything we want to improve has a set of maximal thresholds, and if we want to be the best we can, we've got to make sure to be within those maximal thresholds. Notice, that does not mean being at the top of those maximal thresholds. Yes, everything from 75% or so of your 1RM all the way to 100 makes you stronger when you lift it. But that doesn't mean we need to be training at 100 all the time, especially when we talk about, in the next lecture, fatigue management principle. Training super close to the top end of overload all the time is a bad idea because it fatigues us so much we can't sustain that training. Why is sustaining training important? Because of the second part of the overload definition. Part 2. This training, to get you better, has to be progressive, aka higher in magnitude than most recent training. So what does that mean? Training can't just be hard and be the same level of hard, or, very counterintuitively, training can't be hard but be getting easier through the weeks. Training on average has to get harder. Usually that means you go from the bottom end of your overload threshold closer to the top end and then recycle all the way back down. And then keep pushing it and push it and push it and get better and better in waves. But what progression really means is that if you are starting at a certain level and it's challenging, good challenging means we've hit point number 1, then maybe not the next workout, but maybe the one after, at some point soon, you've got to go even higher still, and then even higher still, because overload is applied, your systems get better, and now that they're better, what used to be incredibly challenging is just merely challenging. And to be more challenged, to continue to get gains, you have to add workload or intensity or relative intensity, make things harder over time. That has some implications, and it actually deletes a bunch of different training that doesn't follow them that we'll talk about in this next section under examples of application. So, proper application example, Susie today held a handstand for 15 hard seconds. It was hard for her to hold a handstand for 15 seconds. We're going to assume that that's in the overload threshold. Next week, she does all kinds of different kind of training this week, and next week when she tries to go for handstands again, she's shooting for 20 seconds. Notice, it's hard to do. Both are hard to do, but she's shooting to go up. That's a proper application of overload. Notice that's just 2 microcycles of training. Overload fundamentally is really occurring at the micro to micro level of training. 1 week or 1 session, the next week or next session should on average be harder. Right? Now, there is such a thing as way too much overload, specifically when it starts to interfere with other principles, particularly fatigue management. If you apply overload religiously all the time, no matter what, even if your fatigue is an issue or if your injury risk is high, then the net balance is negative. So the over-application example says, no matter what, Bill shoots for more weight on the bar every leg workout, technique be damned. I think we all know somebody like Bill that we've seen at the gym. Like, I gotta hit this PR of 385 in the squat, and you watch them, hit 365 right before, and their spine bent and their knees caved in, and they cut their depth halfway, and you're like, you really sure 385 is a good idea? And they say, overload, man, you gotta lift heavier, otherwise you're backsliding, bro. Yeah, but maybe there's a time to bring fatigue down to clean up our technique so that we can continue to present overload safely and effectively in the direction we want, as opposed to just more without any utter regard for anything. Remember, all the training principles have to work in concert with each other to produce the best way of training. You can't just take a look at them alone. It's like saying, I want the biggest possible engine in my race car, but parts of it stick out and ruin the aerodynamics of your car. Is it good to have as big of an engine as you can? Yeah, but that's limited by the aerodynamic constraints, the weight constraints of the car, the kind of fuel it uses. So if your only goal is a big engine, you're actually going to slow the car down on average, even though your engine is big. So overload has to be seen as just one of the principles of the many, all of which can't be violated if overload is to be applied properly. Now, that's over-application of overload. Under-application can be done in 3 distinct ways. We can under-apply the threshold condition, we can under-apply the progression condition, or we can just mess up completely and under-apply them both. Let's check out an example for that. So, and first, before I say that, failing at both of them is worse than just failing at one. So if your training is at least difficult, maybe even if it wasn't as difficult as it was historically, because it's in the maximum threshold, it will still make you better. If your training is not within the maximum threshold, but it's better than last time, yeah, you're not going to get better from that, but at least you're on your way to getting better later. If you keep that up, eventually you'll end up in the maximal threshold, hopefully. So failing at them both, definitely the worst thing you can do. So for example, failing the threshold condition. So Alex's squat max is 500 pounds. That's a 1RM. He does 4 sets of 5 with 225 pounds as a strength workout this week, and then 4 sets of 5 with 235 next week. So 225 for 4x5 this week, okay? 235 for 4x5 next week. He's got a progression and it's going in the right direction. The problem is, sets of 5 with 225 or 235 when you're a 500-pound squatter can be considered a warm-up and pretty much nothing else. He's a way outside of his overload threshold, which probably for strength is something like, oh man, at least 360-ish pounds, maybe closer to 400 pounds is where he really needs to be to get stronger. Luckily, Alex fixed that problem for us, but he created a new one. So, example number 2 of under application, failing the progression condition, Alex goes, okay, I know I need to lift heavy, I got him. Does 455 pounds for sets of 3 in week 1. Okay, great. And then the next week does 445, less, also for triples. Now, is it true that 435 for triples is not overloading in the sense that it is not within his maximal threshold? 445 for triples with a 500 max squat is definitely right in that strength range, certainly higher than the minimum. It's in the overload threshold for sure. But it's not as much as 455 for triples. So he's getting plenty of strength enhancement here, but very little here. If he keeps that up, not only will he exit the overload threshold altogether, but that reverse sort of progression has been shown directly in the literature, to nobody's surprise, works much worse than progressing upwards, right? Yes, it's good to be in that overload threshold, but going up in that threshold is better than going down in that threshold or just kind of staying the same in that threshold. Alex, we tell him about this and he really misunderstands us, so he just applies both conditions poorly the next time. He goes, I got this. This time I'll fix it. He does 225 for 5s this week, and then next week he does 215 for 5s. So not only is our overload threshold up here and he's down here, but he's applying a reverse progression, a regression in load the entire time. That's failing both conditions. What can you take away from this? Anytime you see a program that's designed a certain way, take a look through its progressions, especially over the mesocycle, because sometimes week to week is not instructive. There are light weeks and down weeks. Just over the entire mesocycle, is there a progression up? It doesn't have to be linear. It can be a little jumpy, but is there a progression up? And is the bottom end of that mesocycle still hard enough to make some gains for us? Is even the bottom end within the overload threshold? Because if the bottom end is within the overload threshold, the top end sure is, and then the whole mesocycle is, and then we're good to go because we're making gains all the time, checking off the overload principle to its full extent of its use. Right? So, program design implications from this. We'll get into way more implications when we check off specific abilities and we talk about how to train for powerlifting or weightlifting or rugby and all these other sports, and then we'll figure out exactly what overload means, but just the general stuff over here. Implication number 1 is that training should regularly be hard and it will hurt on occasion, okay? There's no way around this at a fundamental level, so accepting it is a good idea. What does this mean? If you're looking for quirks or advanced science or advanced wisdom from people that have trained a long time to get you away from the fact that training is hard and it's heavy. And if you're not a strength athlete, if you're an endurance athlete, training hurts your lungs and it hurts your body and it hurts your soul. If you're looking a way to get away from that maximal threshold that's really tough, you're also looking for a way to get away from either the best rate of gains for beginners and novices and beginners, and you're looking to get away from gains altogether for intermediate, advanced, and highly advanced athletes. Training must be regularly challenging, and it must get harder and harder, and it must be hard, period, to get you your best rate of gains. If you make peace with that, in fact, if you make I was going to say make love with that, but that means something entirely different. If you make peace with that and make friends with that idea, and you chase overload intelligently in the context of the other training principles, especially fatigue management, then you're going to have a really great time, because the very thing you like to do, train hard and harder, is what makes you better. But if you have a mindset of, oh, like I really want to get better, but oh my God, I hate training hard, and it's got to get harder, but it's already super hard. If you're going to try to avoid harder and hard in general, you're not going to see much success in sport nearly to the extent that you would if you accepted those things. Number 2. So number 1 is training is going to be hard. Number 2, I kind of already said, restate really quick, training should chronically get harder. It also sucks, is also unavoidable. So psychologically, try to get used to making that it doesn't suck, and then it'll get better. So for example, what does harder really mean? Well, you know, in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is a sport I do, I roll with other people, which means more or less like live combat, right? And you choke each other and try to do all sorts of joint locks. And as I'm getting better, there are fewer and fewer people around that can give me a challenge. But does that mean that I'm going to continue to get better and better if I don't seek out challenges? No, I have to make my training harder and harder still, which means that I have to come up to people during class, enroll with them that have really high-ranking belts, that are incredibly good, that are very dangerous people, because my training has to get harder. What used to be okay with for me was, maybe rolling with other very novice individuals isn't going to make me better anymore. Even if it's a tough roll, it's got to be harder than ever. So I've got to go seek out those people, get my feelings hurt, get literally hurt, trying to win against them, because only going up against them is now going to make me better. And eventually, imagine you're the world champion at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, something I'm never going to accomplish, but imagine the world champion. That's a tough situation in some sense, because who the hell is he supposed to roll against to get better? He's the best. Everyone's a step down. You got to get really creative in the sense that you got to try to make ways to make training harder, because the world champ knows, I guarantee it, that if training is not getting harder, he's not going to be, or she's not going to be, getting much better. Does that suck? Yes. If you're loading 385 pounds on a squat bar after, just a day ago before you watch this video, and the bar started to bend by itself in the rack, that's kind of like a rite of passage that some lifters will go through when the bar bends on its own when it sits in the rack. And you're like, Jesus Christ, this gravity is bending steel and I'm supposed to be getting under this thing? What does that hold for you? That means that months and years later, you're going to have to put another 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 pounds on that bar and still do what you do. If that scares you, good. If it gives you pause and makes you reconsider training, you got to come to peace with that, because if you're trying to avoid harder and harder training, it's not going to happen. A common question you get from maybe some of the clients you personally train, or certainly some of the ones I've trained, does this ever get easier? No, it doesn't if you're doing it right. It doesn't get easier, but you get better. So the same absolute level of stuff, lifting the 20-pound dumbbells used to be hard for you, now is a sick joke. But now you got to lift the 80s, and they're not a sick joke. So making training harder is indispensable. And again, just like making training hard, period, making training harder, if it's something you're interested in avoiding, you're also interested in avoiding gains at some level. Now, that being said, the key is some kind of regular overload, even though training might not always be harder and harder and harder every single session. So at some times, training might just be barely overloading. So at the beginning of a mesocycle, for example, because you have to leave room for progression. If you just give it your all, what the hell are you going to do next time? At other times, especially towards the end of a mesocycle, training has to be maximally overloading, literally going as far as you possibly can to failure if necessary to get all the last bit of overload before deloading. At sometimes it's going to be progressing very slowly. For example, how much weight you add to the bar during a hypertrophy phase may be very incremental, a couple of pounds here and there. Maybe you add sets one week and add weight the next and alternate like that. And other times it'll be pretty rapidly progressive. During a strength phase or a peaking phase, you can add 15 pounds to the bar every single time. That doesn't mean one of those is necessarily better than the other. There's a time and a place for all of them, as long as those two general principles are held tight. On average, over the course of several weeks, training should get harder, and it should begin already within the maximal threshold and just get harder through that threshold. Lastly, not every training session in succession should be overloading. Not every training session must be overloading, but most should be. Some training sessions are designed to bring down fatigue or work on your technique. Some training sessions are parts of deloads, which are designed to bring down your fatigue a ton. But most of your training should be overloading, and only occasionally at strategic times should you pepper in easier sessions. So if you are, on average, only lifting heavy weights that challenge you once a month, and all the other sessions not super challenging in any way, unless you're ultra super advanced and it takes that long to drop fatigue, there's nobody like that, you're probably not training hard enough. But does this mean you have to train every single session? Has to be more? No way. There's room for deloads, active rest phases, recovery sessions that bring down the fatigue so that you can do what? So you can come back the next time or the time after and then overload further still, keep going up and up and up and up till eventually you're as powerful as the universe itself and you crush Superman between your very fingers. Folks, I'll see you next time for Fatigue management.